Somerset, June 1818. The small chapel at Bramwell House stood silent in the fading afternoon light, its walls bearing witness to a transaction that society would whisper about for months to come. Miss Penelope Ashton, barely 19 years old, stood before the altar in a borrowed gown of ivory silk, her hands trembling as she clutched a simple bouquet of white roses. She was being sold, though the polite word society used was married, to a man she had met only once before, a man whose physicians had given him mere months to live. Across from her stood Lord Sebastian Carlyle, Earl of Meridon, and the sight of him sent a wave of pity through Penelope's chest, despite her own desperate circumstances. At 34, he should have been in the prime of his life, yet he leaned heavily upon an ebony walking stick, his considerable frame swaying slightly with the effort of remaining upright. 22 stone, the servants had whispered when he arrived, though how a dying man could carry such weight remained one of many mysteries surrounding the Earl. His face, pale and drawn with evident exhaustion, still held traces of the handsome man he must have been before illness struck 2 years prior. But it was his eyes that caught Penelope's attention, gray as winter skies, yet possessing a sharp intelligence that seemed at odds with the lethargy affecting his body. The vicar's words flowed over them like water over stone, familiar and meaningless, binding two strangers together in holy matrimony, while Lady Constance Bramwell, Penelope's aunt and tormentor, watched from the front pew with barely concealed satisfaction. Within 3 hours, Penelope would become a wife. Within 6 months, if the physicians were correct, she would become a very wealthy widow. And Lady Constance, who had orchestrated this entire arrangement, would finally have access to the fortune she had coveted since Penelope's father died, leaving behind gambling debts of £35,000 and 3 children with nowhere else to turn. If stories of love found in the most unexpected circumstances move your heart, subscribe now and join us on this journey. You will not want to miss what happens next. The ceremony concluded with mechanical efficiency. Sebastian's hand, when he slipped the gold ring onto Penelope's finger, trembled visibly, though whether from illness or emotion she could not determine. His skin felt cold even through her gloves, and she noticed how carefully he moved, as though his own body had become a burden he could barely carry. When the vicar pronounced them man and wife, Sebastian did not attempt to kiss her, merely offered a slight bow that cost him evident effort before turning to sign the marriage register with painstaking care. "Well done, my dear," Lady Constance murmured as she swept past Penelope in the vestry, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "You have secured your siblings' future admirably. Young George and Anne will never see the inside of a workhouse now, thanks to your sacrifice." She adjusted her burgundy gloves with studied nonchalance. "Of course, when the Earl passes, as Dr. Harrington assures me he will before Christmas, you must remember who arranged this advantageous match. I shall expect my compensation for services rendered." Penelope said nothing, having learned long ago that silence was the only weapon she possessed against her aunt's casual cruelty. Instead, she watched as Sebastian spoke quietly with his solicitor, Mr. Daventry, a gray-haired gentleman who kept shooting concerned glances at his employer. Even that brief conversation seemed to exhaust the Earl, and Penelope saw him grip the edge of the table for support when he thought no one was watching. "My lady," a soft voice spoke at Penelope's elbow, and she turned to find a woman of perhaps 50 years, dressed in sober gray silk with a white lace cap covering her silver hair. "I am Mrs. Dalworth, housekeeper at Meriden Hall. His lordship has asked me to attend to your comfort during the journey to Kent. The carriage is prepared whenever you are ready." "Thank you," Penelope managed, her voice barely above a whisper. The reality of what she had done, of what she had agreed to, was beginning to settle over her like a shroud. She was married, she was a countess, and her husband, by all accounts, was dying of an illness that 19 different physicians had failed to diagnose or treat. The journey to Kent was an arduous affair, spanning 2 full days with a necessary overnight stop at a coaching inn near Guildford. Penelope spent most of the travel time watching Sebastian through lowered lashes as he sat across from her in the well-appointed carriage. He slept for the majority of the journey, his head tilted back against the velvet cushions, his breathing deep and regular. In sleep, the lines of pain and exhaustion eased from his face, and Penelope could see the man he might have been, handsome in a rugged way, with strong features and a determined jaw. His hands, resting on his thighs, were large and capable-looking, though they twitched occasionally as though responding to some dream or involuntary tremor. Mrs. Dalworth, who sat beside Penelope, noticed her observation and spoke quietly to break the silence. "His lordship suffers greatly, my lady, though he bears it with remarkable fortitude. The convulsions come without warning, sometimes 3 or 4 times a day. The physicians call it brain fever, though none of their treatments have brought any relief. We all pray for a miracle, though I confess, hope grows thin." "How long has he been ill?" Penelope asked, keeping her voice low so as not to wake him. 2 years this spring. He was a barrister before the illness struck, one of the most brilliant legal minds in London, they said. He could argue a case for hours without notes, remembering every precedent, every statute. Now he can barely walk from his chamber to the library without exhaustion. Mrs. Dalworth's voice caught with evident affection and sorrow. His dear mother, the Dowager Countess, passed last autumn. They said it was her heart, but I believe it was grief at watching her only son decline so terribly. Penelope absorbed this information in silence, her eyes drawn once more to Sebastian's sleeping form. A brilliant legal mind trapped in a failing body. A man who had once commanded courtrooms reduced to needing assistance to move through his own home. It seemed a particularly cruel fate, and for a moment Penelope forgot her own desperate circumstances in sympathy for his. It was then that Sebastian's body went rigid. The change happened so quickly that Penelope barely had time to process it. One moment he was sleeping peacefully, the next his entire frame had locked into unnatural stillness, his hands curling into fists, his jaw clenching so tightly she could hear his teeth grinding together. His eyes flew open, but they did not see, staring sightlessly at the carriage ceiling as his body began to convulse. "Hold him steady," Mrs. Dalworth commanded, moving swiftly to press Sebastian's shoulders back against the seat. "Do not try to restrain him completely. Just keep him from injuring himself. These episodes pass, but they are violent." Penelope acted on instinct, reaching out to steady Sebastian's head, which had begun striking the wooden panel behind him. His skin burned with sudden fever beneath her hands, and she could feel the tremors coursing through his entire body like waves of electricity. The seizure, for surely that was what this was, lasted perhaps 30 seconds, though it felt like an eternity. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, Sebastian's body relaxed, sagging back against the cushions as unconsciousness claimed him once more. "The physicians say it is the brain fever progressing," Mrs. Dalworth explained as she carefully loosened Sebastian's cravat to help him breathe more easily. "Each episode weakens him further. They have tried bloodletting, purgatives, mercury treatments, even ice baths. Nothing helps. Some days he has 1 seizure, other days as many as 6. There is no pattern we can discern." Penelope stared down at Sebastian's unconscious face, still flushed from the exertion of the seizure, and felt something shift in her chest. She had married this man to save her siblings from destitution, accepting what she believed would be a brief and loveless union ending in convenient widowhood. But watching him struggle against an illness that no one understood, seeing the toll it took on his wasting body, she felt an unexpected surge of determination. This was not the pampered nobleman she had expected, wasting away from excess. This was a man fighting a battle he did not understand, abandoned by the very medical establishment that should have helped him. Meridon Hall revealed itself as the carriage rounded a final curve in the drive late on the second day, and Penelope caught her breath despite herself. The house was magnificent, a sprawling estate of warm gray stone that glowed amber in the fading sunlight. Ivy climbed the western wall, and roses bloomed in profusion around the entrance. Tall windows reflected the sunset, and Penelope could see the manicured gardens stretching away on either side, dotted with ancient oaks and carefully tended flower beds. It was beautiful, serene, and utterly at odds with the tragedy unfolding within its walls. Sebastian had not yet regained consciousness when the carriage stopped. 2 footmen appeared immediately, their faces betraying no surprise at their master's condition, as they carefully lifted him from the carriage and carried him into the house. Mrs. Dalworth followed, issuing quiet orders, while Penelope stood alone in the grand entrance hall, taking in the marble floors, the sweeping staircase, the portraits of previous Earls of Meriden looking down from the walls with stern approval. My lady, a dignified man of perhaps 60 years approached, his butler's livery immaculate. I am Jenkins. Welcome to Meriden Hall. Mrs. Dalworth has had the rose room prepared for you. If you would follow me, I shall show you to your chambers. His lordship will likely sleep until morning after such an episode. Penelope followed Jenkins up the grand staircase, down a corridor lined with more portraits, and into a suite of rooms that took her breath away. The rose room was aptly named, decorated in shades of pink and cream, with an enormous 4-poster bed, a writing desk, a sitting area before the fireplace, and windows that overlooked the gardens. It was more beautiful than any room Penelope had ever occupied in her entire life. Your trunks will be brought up shortly, Jenkins said. Mary, our head housemaid, will attend you. Dinner is typically served at 7, but given the circumstances, Mrs. Dalworth thought you might prefer a tray in your room this evening. That would be most welcome, thank you, Penelope replied, her voice barely above a whisper. When Jenkins withdrew, she sank onto the edge of the bed, suddenly overwhelmed by everything that had transpired. Married, a countess, mistress of this grand estate, and tied to a dying man who had just had a violent seizure in front of her. A knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. My lady? May I come in? A young woman entered at Penelope's invitation, bobbing a quick curtsy. I am Mary, my lady. I have brought hot water for washing and will help you dress for dinner if you wish. Thank you, Mary. Penelope allowed the girl to help her out of the ivory wedding gown, accepting the simple muslin dress offered for evening. As Mary brushed out her hair, Penelope asked carefully, How long have you served at Meriden Hall? Since I was 14, my lady, nearly 10 years now. Mary's hands were gentle as she arranged Penelope's dark hair into a simple knot. It has been a sorrowful house these past 2 years, but perhaps your arrival will bring some light back to these halls. His lordship was very specific in his instructions about your comfort. Before Penelope could respond, there was another knock, and Mrs. Dalworth entered carrying a tray. I thought you might prefer something light this evening, my lady. His lordship has awakened and wishes to speak with you, if you feel capable. He is quite lucid after the episodes pass, though exhausted. I have settled him in the library, as it is less formal than the drawing room. Penelope's heart raced with sudden anxiety. Of course, I shall go to him immediately. The library proved to be a magnificent room lined floor to ceiling with books, their leather spines gleaming in the light of dozens of candles. A fire burned in the massive fireplace, and before it, Sebastian sat in a large wing-backed chair, a blanket over his knees despite the warmth of the evening. He looked impossibly weary, his face drawn, but his gray eyes were clear and focused as they fixed upon Penelope when she entered. Lady Meriden, he said, and his voice, though tired, held a strength that surprised her. Please sit. I apologize for the dramatic introduction to your new home. The convulsions are unpredictable, as you witnessed. Penelope settled into the chair across from him, folding her hands in her lap to stop their trembling. You need not apologize, my lord. I understand you are unwell. Unwell. A bitter smile twisted Sebastian's mouth. That is perhaps the kindest euphemism I have heard. The physicians have run out of polite words, I fear. They now simply call me dying, and leave it at that. He shifted in his chair, the movement clearly causing him discomfort. But we have more important matters to discuss than my imminent demise. I owe you an explanation, Lady Meriden, for why I agreed to this marriage and what I expect from it. My aunt was quite clear about the arrangements, Penelope said quietly. I am to be your wife in name, and in exchange, my siblings are provided for, and my father's debts are cleared. When you pass, I shall receive the widow's portion as outlined in the marriage settlement. It is a business arrangement, nothing more. Yes, the business arrangement. Sebastian's eyes studied her with uncomfortable intensity. But your aunt was not entirely truthful with you, I suspect. May I be frank, Lady Meriden? I would prefer honesty to pleasant lies, my lord. Then you should know that I did not marry you for companionship or comfort in my final months, nor because your aunt convinced me of your charms, considerable though they may be. Sebastian's words were clipped, precise, the voice of the barrister he had once been. I married you because of a promise I made to your mother. Penelope's head jerked up in shock. My mother? You knew my mother? Catherine Ashton was lady-in-waiting to my mother for 15 years. They were dear friends, and your mother was a frequent guest at this house during your childhood, though you were likely too young to remember. When she lay dying of consumption 7 years ago, she made my mother promise to watch over you should anything happen to your father. My mother, in turn, extracted the same promise from me before she passed last autumn. Sebastian's voice softened slightly. When I learned that your father's gambling debts had left you and your siblings destitute, and that your aunt was auctioning you off to the highest bidder, I could not allow it. Better you should be a wealthy widow after a few months than trapped in a miserable marriage to Lord Edgeworth or Sir Reginald for decades. Tears pricked at Penelope's eyes, and she blinked them back fiercely. You married me out of duty to my mother? I married you to protect you, as I promised I would. That is all this is, Lady Meriden, a protective arrangement that will ensure your security and that of your siblings. You owe me nothing beyond your name on the marriage certificate. I do not expect wifely devotion or affection. I will likely be dead within 6 months regardless, so you need only endure my company for that brief time. The words should have been reassuring, but instead they filled Penelope with an inexplicable sadness. And if you are not dead within 6 months, she asked quietly, what then? Then the physicians are even more incompetent than I believed, which given their track record seems unlikely. Sebastian attempted to rise from the chair and failed, his legs refusing to support his weight. He sank back with a grunt of frustration. 19 physicians, Lady Meriden. 19 different medical men, from London's finest to obscure specialists from Edinburgh and Bath. All of them have examined me, bled me, purged me, dosed me with every vile concoction known to medical science, and not one of them has been able to stop the convulsions or explain the weight gain or halt my decline. They call it brain fever because they have no other name for it, but they do not understand it, and they cannot cure it. Penelope watched as he struggled to master his frustration, his hands clenching the arms of the chair. The weight gain, she said carefully. The physicians believe it is from excessive eating? Of course they do. It is the obvious conclusion, is it not? A man grows fat, therefore he must be gluttonous. Never mind that I eat less now than I did 2 years ago. Never mind that I have documented every meal, every morsel, in meticulous detail for the past 18 months. They see what they expect to see and ignore evidence that contradicts their assumptions. The bitterness in Sebastian's voice was palpable. They think I am mad for keeping such detailed records. Dr. Harrington told your aunt that my obsessive documentation is itself a sign of mental decline. She has already begun proceedings to have me declared incompetent so she can control the estate as guardian. Shock jolted through Penelope. Lady Constance seeks to have you declared incompetent? Did you not know? Ah, but of course she would not tell you. It would interfere with her plans. Sebastian's laugh held no humor. She believes that a man in my condition is an embarrassment to the peerage. She claims she wants to protect the dignity of the title by hiding me away. Once I am declared unfit to manage my own affairs, she can have me committed to an asylum or confined here under her supervision. She frames it as a mercy, a way to spare society the sight of a crumbling Earl. As my widow, you would inherit the property, yes, but as a young woman with no male relatives to protect you, you would be easy prey for her manipulation. She would control everything through you. The pieces fell into place with horrible clarity. Lady Constance had not arranged this marriage out of kindness or even simple greed. She had orchestrated a much more complex scheme, using the excuse of propriety and dignity to seize the Meridon fortune regardless of when or how Sebastian died. Penelope felt ill. "Why did you not tell me this before the wedding?" she asked. "Would you have believed me? Or would you have thought it the paranoid ramblings of a dying madman?" Sebastian met her eyes steadily. "I am not mad, Lady Meridon. I am ill with something the physicians do not understand, but my mind remains clear. Everything I have told you is documented, and Mr. Daventry will confirm it. I married you to protect you from your aunt's schemes and to fulfill my promise to your mother. That is the truth of our arrangement." Penelope sat in silence for a long moment, processing everything she had heard. Finally, she spoke. "Then we must protect each other, my lord. If Lady Constance threatens both of us, surely we are stronger together than apart." Something shifted in Sebastian's expression, a flicker of surprise and perhaps respect. "You are braver than I anticipated, Lady Meridon. I am desperate, my lord, which is not the same thing. But I am also stubborn, and I have spent the past 3 years enduring my aunt's cruelty. I will not let her win." Penelope leaned forward, her voice gaining strength. "Tell me about these journals you keep, the documentation the physicians dismiss. I should like to see them if you permit." Sebastian studied her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "They are in my study, which connects to my bedchamber. I shall have them brought to you tomorrow. But I warn you, they make for grim reading. 2 years of progressive decline, meticulously recorded, with no answers and no hope." "Perhaps," Penelope said quietly, "fresh eyes will see something the physicians missed." Thus began the strangest partnership Penelope had ever imagined. The following morning, after Sebastian had endured another violent convulsion that left him unconscious until nearly noon, Penelope received 3 leather-bound journals delivered to the library by Mrs. Dalworth. The housekeeper's expression was curious, but not disapproving as she set them on the reading table. "His lordship said you were to have access to anything you required, my lady. If you need additional records, the household accounts are kept in the estate office, and his medical bills are filed separately in the study." Mrs. Dalworth hesitated, then added softly, "It does my heart good to see someone taking an interest in his lordship's condition, besides to pronounce him dying. He has suffered alone for too long." Penelope opened the first journal with trembling hands. Before her father's death, she had spent 3 years managing the household at her aunt's estate. While Lady Constance was busy with society, Penelope had been the one balancing the books, tracking every bushel of flour in the storehouse and every penny in the ledgers. Her mind had been trained by necessity to spot discrepancies in numbers that others ignored, to find the single error in a column of figures that explained a loss. Now, she applied that same rigorous scrutiny to Sebastian's life. The entries were clinical, almost scientific in their detachment. June 12, 1816. 7 o'clock morning. Seizure lasting approximately 40 seconds, preceded by sensation of heat and dizziness. No memory of episode itself. Exhaustion following. Weight upon rising, 21 stone, 6 pounds. Food consumed previous day, documented separately. No obvious correlation to timing of seizure. The entries continued in similar fashion, page after page of careful observation. Weight fluctuations were tracked daily, sometimes showing increases, despite documented decreases in food consumption. Seizures were described in clinical detail, their frequency, duration, and any factors that might have triggered them. Sebastian had noted everything from the weather to his emotional state to the specific foods consumed at each meal. It was this last detail that caught Penelope's attention as she worked her way through the second journal, which covered the 18 months from autumn 1816 to spring 1818. Sebastian had maintained a separate column for meals, listing not just quantities, but specific ingredients. And as Penelope traced her finger down the pages, comparing meal entries to seizure timings, a pattern began to emerge that made her heart race with sudden excitement. It was the same sensation she used to get when she found a missing entry in her aunt's ledger, the sudden clarity of cause and effect. Every single seizure documented in the second journal had occurred within 2 to 4 hours of consuming bread, pastries, or any grain-based food. Penelope flipped back through the pages, checking and rechecking. The pattern held. On days when Sebastian ate only meat, vegetables, and fruits, no seizures were recorded. On days when he consumed even small amounts of bread or grain products, seizures invariably followed. How had no one noticed this? How had 19 physicians examined these records and missed such an obvious correlation? But even as the question formed, Penelope knew the answer. They had not been looking for it. They had already decided Sebastian's illness was brain fever, an incurable deterioration of mental faculties, and they had interpreted all evidence through that lens. They had dismissed his meticulous records as obsessive behavior, a symptom rather than a tool. "My lady?" Mary appeared in the doorway, startling Penelope from her reading. "His lordship has awakened and wishes to know if you will take luncheon with him in the conservatory. He says the sunlight sometimes eases his headaches." "Yes, of course." Penelope closed the journal carefully, her mind racing. "Mary, may I ask you something? Who plans his lordship's meals?" "Cook prepares whatever doctor. Harrington recommends, my lady. Mostly broths and light fare, as the doctor says rich foods tax his lordship's system. Though truth be told, his lordship barely eats half of what is sent up." "And bread? Does his lordship eat bread regularly?" Mary looked puzzled by the question, but answered readily enough. "Oh yes, my lady. Dr. Harrington insists on it. He says bread is wholesome and easily digested, essential for maintaining strength. His lordship has toast with every breakfast and usually bread with his luncheon as well." Penelope's hands clenched in her lap. "I see. Thank you, Mary." The conservatory proved to be a beautiful glass structure attached to the south wing of the house, filled with exotic plants and warm with trapped sunlight. Sebastian sat at a small wrought iron table, looking marginally more alert than he had the previous evening. A simple luncheon had been laid out, cold meats and cheeses, fruit, and yes, a basket of fresh bread. "Good afternoon, Lady Meriden," Sebastian greeted her as she entered. "I hope you were not too disturbed by this morning's episode. Mrs. Dalworth said it was a particularly violent one." "I heard the commotion, but did not intrude." Penelope settled into the chair across from him, eyeing the bread basket with new suspicion. "I have been reading your journals, as you gave me leave to do." "Ah. Grim reading, as I warned." "Scientific reading," Penelope corrected. "Remarkably thorough and methodical. Tell me, my lord, have any of the physicians who examined these records attempted to correlate your seizures with specific foods consumed?" Sebastian's hand paused halfway to his teacup. "Not to my knowledge. Why do you ask?" "Because I have spent the past 3 hours comparing your meal records to your seizure timings, and I have found a pattern that appears consistent across 18 months of entries." Penelope leaned forward, her voice intense. "Every seizure you have documented occurred within hours of consuming bread or grain products. On days when you ate no grains, you had no seizures." The teacup clinked against its saucer as Sebastian set it down with unsteady hands. "That is impossible." "Is it? Look at the entries yourself. June 14th, 1817. Breakfast of toast and jam, seizure at 10 o'clock morning. June 15th, no grains consumed, no seizure. June 16th, bread with luncheon, seizure at 3 o'clock afternoon. The pattern repeats throughout the journal. Sebastian stared at her as though she had sprouted a second head. You are suggesting that bread, common bread that millions of people consume daily without ill effect, is causing my convulsions. I am suggesting that something in grain products triggers your seizures. Yes, I know it sounds absurd, but the correlation is undeniable. And there is more. Your weight gain occurred primarily during periods when you consumed more grains in an attempt to regain strength. When your appetite failed and you ate less bread naturally, your weight stabilized or even decreased, despite consuming fewer overall calories. Sebastian pushed away from the table, agitation evident in every line of his body. If what you suggest were true, why would no physician have noticed it? 19 different doctors examined those journals. Because they were not looking for it. They had already decided you suffered from brain fever, and they interpreted everything through that assumption. They saw obsessive documentation where they should have seen scientific investigation. They saw excessive eating where they should have seen unexplained constitutional disorder. Penelope's voice softened. I am not a physician, my lord. I have no medical training, but I have spent 3 years managing household accounts and budgets for my aunt, tracking expenditures and patterns. I recognize data when I see it. Sebastian sank back into his chair, his face pale. Even if you are correct, what difference does it make? I cannot simply stop eating bread and expect to recover. It is the very foundation of diet. Dr. Harrington would never approve such a radical alteration. Then we do not tell Dr. Harrington. The words were out before Penelope could stop them, bold and reckless. We conduct an experiment. 4 weeks with no grains of any kind in your diet. If I am wrong, you will have lost nothing. If I am right, the seizures will stop. And how do you propose we accomplish this without the household staff reporting to Dr. Harrington, who reports everything to your aunt? Despite his skepticism, there was a flicker of something in Sebastian's eyes that might have been hope. We tell them that I have taken an interest in natural philosophies and wish to try a dietary regime I read about in a book on continental health practices. We make it my eccentric whim as a new bride. The servants will think me foolish, but they will comply with my wishes as lady of the house. Sebastian studied her for a long moment, his gray eyes searching her face. Why are you doing this? You gain nothing from attempting to cure me. Indeed, your financial situation would be far more secure if I died on schedule, because you married me to protect me from my aunt's schemes, and I will not repay that kindness by standing idle while you suffer from something that might be preventable. Penelope met his gaze steadily. And because, if Lady Constance succeeds in having you declared incompetent, we both lose everything. Our only defense is proving that your mind is sound and your body can recover. Give me 4 weeks, my lord. What have you to lose? My dignity, perhaps, when your theory proves wrong and the entire household whispers about the mad Earl and his deluded wife. But even as he spoke, Sebastian reached out and pushed the breadbasket away. Very well, Lady Meriden. 4 weeks, but I want everything documented as thoroughly as the past 2 years have been. If we are to conduct an experiment, we shall do it properly. Thus began what would later be known in certain progressive medical circles as the Meriden experiment, though at the time it was simply a desperate gamble by 2 people with nothing left to lose. Penelope took control of the household menus with an authority that startled the staff but was accepted as the new countess, exerting her authority. She met with cook, a formidable woman named Mrs. Griswold, and outlined her requirements with careful precision. No bread, no pastries, no cakes or biscuits, Penelope explained, watching Mrs. Griswold's eyebrows climb toward her cap. No wheat flour, no barley, no oats or rye. All of his lordship's meals are to consist of meats, fish, eggs, vegetables, fruits, nuts, and dairy products, nothing that contains any grain whatsoever. Begging your pardon, my lady, but Dr. Harrington specifically ordered bread for his lordship's strength. He will not be pleased to learn of this change. Doctor, Harrington is not the mistress of this house, Penelope said with a breezy confidence she did not feel. I have been reading the latest journals from Paris. The French court is quite taken with this new regimen for clearing the complexion and balancing the humors. It is a continental fashion, Mrs. Griswold, and I should like to see if it suits his lordship. We must stay current with the times, must we not? The cook bobbed a curtsy, her expression doubtful but placated by the explanation of a foreign fad. As you say, my lady, though it seems a queer sort of fashion to deny a man his bread. The first week was not the miracle they had hoped for. In fact, it was a trial of patience. Sebastian felt worse before he felt better. He became irritable and lethargic, his body craving the familiar comfort of bread and pastry. He snapped at the servants and even at Penelope, his temper flaring with a volatility that was unlike him. This is madness, he growled on the 5th day, pushing away a plate of roasted chicken and greens. I feel weak as a kitten, and my head aches abominably. Your experiment is a failure, Lady Meriden. The body often resists change before it accepts it, Penelope replied calmly, though she marked his irritability in the ledger with concern. Give it time. We agreed on 4 weeks. On the 8th day, however, the fog began to lift. Sebastian experienced what would have been his usual morning seizure time after breakfast, felt the familiar heat and dizziness approaching, but the seizure never came. The sensation passed after mere seconds, leaving him shaken but conscious. It could be coincidence, he told Penelope over luncheon that day, but his voice held a tremor that might have been cautious hope. One avoided seizure proves nothing. Then we continue documenting and wait for more data, Penelope replied calmly, though her own hands trembled as she made entries in the new journal she had started specifically for the experiment. By the end of the 2nd week, Sebastian had gone 10 consecutive days without a single seizure. His weight had dropped by nearly 2 stone, and for the first time in months, he was sleeping through the night without waking from convulsions. The change in his energy was remarkable. He began spending hours in the library, reading and working on legal correspondence that had been neglected during his illness. His face regained color, and the perpetual exhaustion that had shadowed his eyes began to lift. I can think clearly again, he told Penelope on the 15th day, wonder evident in his voice. I had not realized how much the constant fog had dulled my mind. It was gradual, you see, so subtle I did not notice until it began to clear. But this clarity, this is how I used to feel before the illness struck. Penelope carefully recorded every observation in their experiment journal, noting not just the absence of seizures, but the improvement in Sebastian's mental acuity, his increased stamina, the weight loss that occurred despite him eating more overall calories than he had been consuming previously. She documented his improved sleep, the reduction in headaches that had plagued him daily, even the subtle changes in his mood and temperament. It was on the 19th day that Lady Constance made her unexpected appearance. Penelope was in the morning room going over household accounts when Jenkins announced her aunt with obvious disapproval. Lady Constance swept into the room in a gown of deep purple, her sharp eyes immediately assessing everything from the furnishings to Penelope's simple day dress with critical precision. Well, niece, I see you have settled into your role as nurse to a dying man with admirable efficiency, Lady Constance began without preamble. I came to see how you were managing, though I confess I am surprised to find you looking so well. Most young brides would be prostrate with grief by now, anticipating their husband's imminent demise. His lordship's health has improved remarkably, Penelope said carefully, setting aside her ledger. I have reason to hope the physicians were overly pessimistic in their predictions. Improved? Lady Constance's laugh was sharp and disbelieving. My dear child, Dr. Harrington himself told me that the Earl has perhaps 2 months remaining, 3 at most. These apparent improvements are likely nothing more than a final rallying of strength before the end. I have seen it before in the dying. They seem to recover briefly, and then they decline rapidly and permanently. Nevertheless, I have observed genuine improvement over the past 3 weeks. The seizures have ceased entirely, and his strength returns daily. Lady Constance's eyes narrowed dangerously. Ceased entirely? That seems unlikely given the severity of his condition. Unless... She paused, her expression shifting to something almost gleeful. It seems unlikely unless he has been hiding his seizures from you to spare your feelings. Or perhaps he is dosing himself with laudanum to suppress the symptoms temporarily. That would explain the apparent improvement, though it only hastens the ultimate decline. Lord Meriden takes no laudanum and hides nothing from me. The improvement is genuine and documented. Documented. Lady Constance's voice dripped with scorn. Ah, yes, the famous journals. Dr. Harrington mentioned the Earl's obsessive recording of symptoms. It is itself a sign of mental deterioration, you know. No rational man keeps such meticulous records unless his mind is already slipping into madness. Anger flared in Penelope's chest, hot and sudden. Those journals are not evidence of madness, but of scientific inquiry. His lordship has been attempting to understand his own illness through careful observation, something the physicians should have applauded rather than dismissed. Scientific inquiry. Lady Constance rose from her seat, moving to the window with studied casualness. Tell me, niece, has the Earl discussed his financial affairs with you? Has he perhaps suggested that you should take a more active role in managing the estate? The question set warning bells ringing in Penelope's mind. We have discussed household management as is appropriate for the mistress of Meriden Hall. Why do you ask? Because I have filed a petition with the Court of Chancery to have Lord Meriden declared incompetent to manage his own affairs. It is a matter of dignity, Penelope. We cannot have a peer of the realm convulsing and wasting away while making a mockery of his title with mad scribblings. It brings shame upon the family name. Shame! Penelope stood up, her voice trembling with suppressed rage. You speak of shame while plotting to steal his life? I speak of protection, Lady Constance corrected coldly. Given his documented mental decline and the testimony of multiple physicians regarding his deteriorating condition, I expect the court will appoint me as guardian of his estate until such time as he passes and you inherit. As your only living relative, it is my duty to protect your interests and ensure the estate is properly managed during this difficult transition. We must hide his condition from the world, not parade his madness. Penelope felt as though the floor had dropped away beneath her feet. You have no right. Lord Meriden is perfectly competent. Is he? A man who has gained 22 stone while claiming to eat almost nothing? A man who keeps obsessive journals documenting imaginary patterns in his illness? A man whose own physicians have declared him suffering from progressive brain fever? Lady Constance's smile was cold and triumphant. The court hearing is scheduled for 6 weeks hence. I suggest you prepare yourself for the reality that your husband will soon be under my care, along with the fortune you were so eager to secure through this marriage. After her aunt departed, Penelope sat alone in the morning room, her hands shaking with fury and fear. Lady Constance had accelerated her timeline, threatened by the very improvements that had given Penelope and Sebastian hope. If they could not prove that Sebastian's recovery was genuine and lasting, if they could not demonstrate that his illness had been misdiagnosed all along, the court would declare him incompetent and everything would fall under Lady Constance's control. She found Sebastian in the library, poring over legal texts that had not been opened in 2 years. He looked up as she entered, and the question died on his lips when he saw her expression. Your aunt has been here, he said flatly. I can see it in your face. Penelope explained everything, watching as Sebastian's expression shifted from concern to anger to grim determination. When she finished, he closed the legal text with deliberate care and met her eyes. 6 weeks, he said quietly. 6 weeks to prove that I am not mad, not dying, and perfectly capable of managing my own affairs. It should be sufficient time to complete our experiment and demonstrate the results. But how do we prove it to the court? Lady Constance has 19 physicians willing to testify that you suffer from incurable brain fever. We have only our own observations and these journals that they already dismiss as evidence of madness. Sebastian's smile was sharp and dangerous, the smile of the brilliant barrister he had once been. Then we find a physician who will listen to evidence rather than dismiss it based on preconceived assumptions. Someone with the courage to challenge conventional medical wisdom, and we document our experiment so thoroughly, so scientifically, that the court cannot ignore it regardless of what other physicians claim. But where do we find such a physician? You have already consulted 19 different doctors, all of whom were recommended by Dr. Harrington or operated within the same established medical circles. What we need is someone outside that system, someone with radical ideas who is not afraid to challenge orthodoxy. Sebastian's fingers drummed on the desk as his mind worked through the problem with lawyerly precision. There was a man I read about 2 years ago, before the worst of the illness struck. A physician who had been struck off the rolls of the Royal College of Physicians for promoting unorthodox theories about diet and disease. Dr. Matthias Wycliffe. He had studied on the continent and claimed to have documented cases where elimination of certain foods cured previously untreatable conditions. Where is this Dr. Wycliffe now? I have no idea, but I have resources and contacts throughout London still. If he can be found, I will find him. It took nearly a week of correspondence and inquiries, during which Sebastian's improvement continued at a pace that even Penelope found remarkable. By the 25th day of their experiment, he had lost a total of 4 stone and was walking the grounds of Meridon Hall for an hour each morning without fatigue. The mental fog that had plagued him for 2 years had lifted entirely, and his legal mind was as sharp as it had ever been. When seizure time approached, he experienced only the briefest warning sensation before it passed harmlessly, as though his body was remembering the old pattern but could no longer execute it. Finally, a response arrived. Dr. Matthias Wycliffe was practicing in a small clinic in Southwark, treating patients too poor to afford the fashionable physicians of Harley Street. He agreed to travel to Kent to evaluate Lord Meridon, though his letter warned that he held no truck with aristocratic nonsense and would offer his honest medical opinion regardless of whether it pleased his prospective patient. Dr. Wycliffe arrived on a rainy afternoon in late July, a tall, spare man of perhaps 50 years with iron-gray hair and penetrating blue eyes that missed nothing. He spent 4 hours with Sebastian, examining him thoroughly, reviewing both the original journals and the new experiment documentation that Penelope had maintained with meticulous care. When he finally emerged from the examination, his expression was grave but thoughtful. "Lord Meridon," he said without preamble, "you do not suffer from brain fever, nor is your mind deteriorating in any fashion. You suffer from what I have seen in perhaps a dozen cases during my years studying unusual maladies on the continent. There is no English name for it, but the Italian physicians call it malatia celiaca, a sensitivity to certain grains that causes seizures, digestive disturbances, and paradoxical weight gain in some individuals. The mechanism is not fully understood, but the cure is exactly what Lady Meridon has implemented: complete elimination of wheat, barley, rye, and related grains from the diet." The relief that washed over Penelope was so intense it made her lightheaded. Then the experiment worked. The correlation was real. More than real. It was scientifically sound observation that 19 other physicians missed because they were not looking for it. Lady Meridon, you may have saved your husband's life through simple curiosity and careful documentation. Dr. Wycliffe turned back to Sebastian. The improvements you have experienced over the past month will continue, provided you maintain strict adherence to the grain-free diet. Your weight will stabilize at a healthy level, the seizures will not return, and your mental faculties, which have always been sound, will remain so. You are not dying, my lord. You are recovering from a chronic condition that was killing you slowly because no one recognized it for what it was. Sebastian's voice was rough with emotion. "Can you testify to this in court? My wife's aunt has filed a petition to have me declared incompetent, and the hearing is in less than 3 weeks. I can and will testify, though I warn you that the medical establishment will not welcome my testimony. I was struck off the rolls for refusing to conform to accepted practices, and my opinions carry little weight with most of my former colleagues." Dr. Wycliffe's smile was grim. "However, I can present scientific evidence and documentation that will be difficult for even the most orthodox physician to dismiss. The transformation in your condition over the past month is dramatic and objectively measurable. Weight loss, cessation of seizures, improved mental clarity, all documented day by day with the kind of precision that courts respect." "Then we have our defense," Sebastian said, and for the first time since Penelope had met him, she heard genuine hope in his voice. "Between your testimony, our documentation, and my own appearance before the court, we can prove that Lady Bramwell's petition is without merit." The next 2 weeks were spent in intense preparation. Dr. Wycliffe remained at Meriden Hall, conducting additional examinations and helping Penelope refine their documentation into a format that would be comprehensible to laymen in a courtroom. Sebastian, meanwhile, threw himself into preparing his legal arguments with the fierce joy of a man who had thought his career ended forever. He pored over precedents regarding competency hearings, prepared detailed rebuttals to every claim Dr. Harrington might make, and practiced his courtroom arguments with Penelope as his audience. "The key," he explained one evening as they reviewed his notes in the library, "is to demonstrate not just that I have recovered, but that the original diagnosis was fundamentally flawed. We must show the court that the physicians made assumptions based on incomplete observation and then interpreted all subsequent evidence through the lens of those assumptions. It is a pattern of reasoning that occurs in both law and medicine, unfortunately. Once a conclusion is reached, contradictory evidence is dismissed rather than examined." Penelope listened, marveling at the transformation in the man before her. This was not the exhausted, defeated Earl she had married scarcely 2 months ago. This was a brilliant legal mind in full command of his faculties, passionate and articulate, demolishing arguments with surgical precision. When he spoke of the prejudices built into medical diagnosis, his gray eyes blazed with intellectual fire. It was in that moment, watching Sebastian dissect the logical fallacies in Dr. Harrington's methodology, that Penelope realized with sudden clarity that she had fallen in love with her husband. The thought should have terrified her. They had married as strangers, united by necessity and a promise to a dead woman. He had told her explicitly that he expected nothing from her beyond her name on their marriage certificate. Their relationship was supposed to be temporary, a brief interlude before a convenient widowhood that would leave her wealthy and independent. But somewhere in the past 2 months, between reading his journals and conducting their desperate experiment, between shared meals and evening conversations about medical theory and legal precedent, something had changed. She no longer saw him as the dying Earl she had married out of necessity. She saw him as Sebastian, a man of remarkable intelligence and quiet courage, who had fought against an illness no one understood while maintaining his dignity and his determination to protect those he felt responsible for. "Penelope?" Sebastian's voice broke through her reverie. "You have that expression again, the one you get when your mind is working through a problem. What are you thinking?" She could not tell him the truth, so she said instead, "I was thinking that Lady Constance severely underestimated both of us. She thought she was manipulating 2 desperate people with no resources or options. She did not anticipate that we might become allies rather than victims." Something shifted in Sebastian's expression, a warmth that had not been there before. She made a tactical error, assuming that a marriage of convenience could not become something more. "Though I confess, I made the same error initially." He set aside his notes, giving her his full attention. "You have proven yourself far more than I expected, Penelope. Not just in solving the mystery of my illness, but in managing the household, standing up to your aunt, conducting our experiment with scientific rigor. You have the mind of a natural philosopher and the courage of a barrister. I am fortunate to have you as my wife, regardless of the circumstances that brought us together." The words warmed Penelope even as they made her heart ache with longing for something more. "We have been fortunate in each other," she replied carefully, "though the true test still lies ahead. If we cannot convince the court that your recovery is genuine, all our efforts will mean nothing." The Court of Chancery hearing took place on the 14th of August, 1818, in a courtroom packed with curious spectators who had come to witness the fate of the allegedly mad Earl of Meriden. Lady Constance sat in the front row with Dr. Harrington beside her, both of them radiating confidence. They had no reason to doubt their victory. After all, they had the weight of established medical opinion on their side, while Sebastian had only the testimony of a disgraced physician and his own supposedly unreliable observations. The hearing began with Lady Constance's solicitor presenting her petition. He outlined Sebastian's medical history, the 19 physicians who had examined him, the progressive deterioration documented over 2 years. He presented Dr. Harrington, who testified in authoritative tones about brain fever, inevitable decline, and the obsessive documentation that demonstrated Lord Meriden's deteriorating mental state. "The journals themselves reveal the problem," Dr. Harrington declared. "No rational man would maintain such detailed records unless his faculties were already compromised. The Earl's insistence on finding patterns where none exist, his conviction that common bread could cause seizures, these are classic signs of paranoid delusion accompanying advanced brain fever." When it was Sebastian's turn to present his defense, he rose from his seat without assistance. Dr. Harrington opened his mouth to object, likely to claim that the Earl needed help, but the words died in his throat. Sebastian walked to the front of the courtroom with steady, confident strides. The courtroom went silent. Those who had attended expecting to see a dying man, bloated and barely conscious, could not reconcile that image with the healthy, vigorous gentleman who now stood before them. The visual evidence alone was a devastating blow to the opposition's argument. Sebastian spoke for nearly 30 minutes, and Penelope watched in admiration as he systematically dismantled every claim made against him. He explained the concept of scientific observation, the difference between obsessive behavior and methodical investigation. He walked the judges through the correlation between grain consumption and seizures, presenting the data in terms so clear that even laymen could understand it. "The physicians diagnosed brain fever because they had no other explanation for my symptoms," Sebastian said, his barrister's voice carrying to every corner of the courtroom. But the absence of an explanation is not the same as evidence of a specific diagnosis. When confronted with data that contradicted their assumptions, they dismissed the data rather than reconsidering their conclusions. This is not medicine. This is dogma. He presented the experiment documentation, showing the dramatic improvements that had occurred when grains were eliminated from his diet. Weight loss, cessation of seizures, return of mental clarity, all objectively measurable and thoroughly documented. Then he called Dr. Wycliffe to testify. The disgraced physician's testimony was devastating in its scientific precision. He explained grain sensitivity, presented cases he had documented from his continental studies, and described the mechanism by which certain proteins in wheat and related grains could trigger seizures in susceptible individuals. He admitted freely that the medical establishment did not recognize this condition, but pointed out that medical knowledge was constantly evolving, and what was unknown today might be common knowledge tomorrow. 20 years ago, physicians bled patients for nearly every ailment, believing it balanced the humors, Dr. Wycliffe said. Today we recognize that practice as harmful nonsense. Medical orthodoxy is not the same as medical truth, and any physician worth his credentials should be willing to follow evidence wherever it leads, even if it contradicts accepted wisdom. Finally, Sebastian himself testified about his transformation over the past 2 months. He answered questions from the judges with clarity and precision, demonstrating the keen legal mind that had made him one of London's most respected barristers before illness struck. There was no confusion in his responses, no paranoia, no evidence whatsoever of mental deterioration. Lady Constance's solicitor attempted to argue that the improvement was temporary, a final rally before inevitable decline. But when pressed to explain how such a rally could account for 4 stone of weight loss and complete cessation of seizures maintained over 8 weeks, he had no answer that did not sound desperate. The judges deliberated for less than an hour before returning with their decision. The senior judge's voice was grave as he addressed the courtroom. "We find no evidence whatsoever that Lord Meriden is incompetent to manage his own affairs. On the contrary, his lordship has demonstrated both scientific acumen in investigating his own illness and sound judgment in seeking treatment when conventional medicine failed him. The petition filed by Lady Bramwell is denied with costs." He fixed Lady Constance with a stern gaze. "Furthermore, this court takes a dim view of petitions motivated by transparent greed or social embarrassment rather than genuine concern for the alleged incompetent. Lady Bramwell, you are fortunate we do not refer this matter for prosecution on charges of malicious litigation." The courtroom erupted in whispers and exclamations. Lady Constance's face went white, then red, then white again as the implications sank in. She had not only lost, she had been publicly humiliated by 3 judges of the Court of Chancery. Her reputation, already questionable, was now destroyed beyond repair. Sebastian turned to find Penelope in the crowd, and the smile he gave her was brilliant with triumph and relief. She smiled back, tears stinging her eyes, and for a moment the crowded courtroom faded away until there were only the 2 of them, partners who had fought together and won. The Harrington Ball 6 weeks later was one of the social events of the season, attended by anyone of consequence in London society. Penelope stood before her mirror in the Rose Room at Meriden Hall, allowing Mary to arrange her hair and fasten the crimson silk gown that had been made specifically for this occasion. The dress was magnificent, cut in the latest fashion with delicate embroidery along the hem and neckline, the deep red complementing her dark hair and making her skin glow. "You look beautiful, my lady," Mary said softly. "His lordship will be struck speechless when he sees you." Penelope barely heard her, too focused on calming her racing heart. This would be Sebastian's first major social appearance since his recovery, the moment when London society would see for themselves that the dying Earl of Meriden had been restored to health. It was also the event where their marriage would be scrutinized by hundreds of curious eyes, all wondering what had truly transpired during those dramatic months at Meriden Hall. Sebastian was waiting in the entrance hall when Penelope descended the stairs, and the look on his face when he saw her made her breath catch. He had regained his health completely in the 3 months since the court hearing, his weight now at a normal level for his height and build, his face no longer drawn with exhaustion. In his formal evening attire, he looked every inch the aristocrat he was, handsome and confident, bearing no trace of the illness that had nearly killed him. "You are exquisite," he said quietly as she reached the bottom of the stairs. "I fear every man in the ballroom will envy me tonight." "And every woman will envy me," Penelope replied, allowing him to take her arm. "You look remarkably well, my lord. No one would believe you were at death's door mere months ago." "Thanks to my brilliant wife, who refused to accept the inevitable." Sebastian's voice dropped to a whisper as they walked to the waiting carriage. "Penelope, there is something I must tell you before we arrive at the ball. Something I have been trying to find the courage to say for weeks now." Penelope's heart lurched with sudden anxiety. "What is it?" "This marriage began as a protective arrangement, a convenience meant to shield you from your aunt's schemes and allow me to die with the satisfaction of having kept a promise to your mother. But these past months have changed everything. You are no longer the desperate girl I married out of duty. You are my partner, my equal, the woman who saved my life when medicine failed, and I find myself hoping that what began as convenience might become something more. They had reached the carriage, and Sebastian handed her inside before settling beside her. The evening light filtering through the windows cast his face in sharp relief as he continued. "I am asking if you might consider making our marriage a true one, not out of obligation or gratitude, but because I have come to care for you deeply, to respect and admire you, and dare I hope, to love you." He took her hand, his grip warm and steady. "I know I have no right to ask this of you. You married a dying man expecting to be free within months, but I am not dying anymore, and I find I very much wish to live the rest of my life with you as my true wife, if you will have me." Tears spilled down Penelope's cheeks unchecked as she looked into Sebastian's gray eyes and saw everything she had been afraid to hope for reflected there. "I would have you gladly," she whispered. "I think I began falling in love with you the moment I read your journals and saw the brilliant mind trapped by illness. And I know I loved you completely the day you argued your case before the court, defending not just yourself, but the scientific method itself against medical dogma." Sebastian pulled her close, and Penelope went into his arms with a sigh of relief, resting her head against his chest as his heart beat steady beneath her ear. "Then we shall attend this ball as true partners," he murmured into her hair, "and let society whisper all they like about the Meridon miracle. Let them wonder how a dying man recovered and how a marriage of convenience became a love match. We shall know the truth, and that is sufficient." The ballroom at Harrington House blazed with candlelight from a dozen crystal chandeliers, and the cream of London society filled the space in a dazzling array of silks and jewels. A shocked silence fell over the room when the butler announced Lord and Lady Meridon, followed immediately by a buzz of excited whispers that rolled through the crowd like a wave. Sebastian and Penelope made their entrance with heads held high, moving through the parted crowd like royalty. Sebastian's transformation was remarkable enough to draw gasps from those who had last seen him barely able to stand. His confident stride, his healthy appearance, his obvious vitality all defied everything society had believed about the dying Earl. But it was the way he looked at his wife that really set tongues wagging. The tenderness in his gaze, the protective way his hand rested at her waist, the pride evident in his expression as he introduced her to various acquaintances, all proclaimed louder than words that this was no marriage of convenience, but a genuine love match. "Lord Meridon," Lady Bellingham exclaimed as they paused near her group, her fan fluttering with excitement. "The reports of your recovery were not exaggerated, I see. You look absolutely splendid. And Lady Meridon, I must say, marriage clearly agrees with you. You are positively glowing." "Marriage to the right person certainly has its benefits," Sebastian replied, his voice warm. "I am fortunate beyond measure in my choice of wife." The dancing began, and Sebastian led Penelope onto the floor for the first waltz. As they moved together, Penelope was acutely aware of hundreds of eyes watching them, assessing, judging, spreading gossip that would dominate society conversation for weeks. But in Sebastian's arms, she found she did not care what they thought. Let them stare. Let them wonder. She had found something infinitely more valuable than social approval. "They are calling you the Meridon mind," Sebastian murmured as they turned. "Did you know? The Countess who solved a medical mystery that baffled 19 physicians. The woman who proved that careful observation trumps medical orthodoxy." "And they call our story the Meridon miracle," Penelope replied. "Though I think the real miracle is not your recovery, but how we found each other through such impossible circumstances." It was during the third waltz, as the evening reached its peak of gaiety, that Penelope noticed a figure standing in the shadows near the terrace doors. Lady Constance, dressed in severe black, watching the festivities with a face twisted by rage and bitter envy. Her social standing had never recovered from the court's public rebuke. She had been forced to retreat to Bath, living on reduced circumstances, avoided by the very society she had once navigated with such calculating skill. Penelope met her aunt's eyes across the crowded ballroom. There was no fear left in Penelope now, only pity. Lady Constance lifted her chin in a gesture of haughty disdain, refusing to acknowledge the defeat, before turning sharply and sweeping out of the room, alone and unnoticed by the vibrant crowd. Sebastian noticed the direction of Penelope's gaze and drew her slightly closer. "She cannot hurt us anymore," he said quietly. "The court's ruling was absolute, and your siblings are safe and well provided for. George is thriving at Eton, and Anne's education is assured. Lady Bramwell has no power over any of us now." "I know. I just find it sad that she cannot see how completely she destroyed herself. If she had shown even a fraction of kindness, she might have shared in our happiness instead of watching it from the shadows." The final dance of the evening found Sebastian making a public toast that silenced the entire ballroom. He raised his glass high, his voice carrying to every corner. "To my remarkable wife," he declared, "the Countess who refused to accept the inevitable, who challenged medical authority with nothing but keen observation and stubborn determination, who saved my life when 19 physicians had given up hope. Lady Meriden, you are the finest partner any man could hope for, and I am honored to spend the rest of my days proving myself worthy of you." The ballroom erupted in applause, genuine and enthusiastic, as Penelope blushed crimson and Sebastian kissed her hand with courtly grace. The whispers that followed were not malicious, but admiring. The Meridons had become a story of hope and transformation, proof that love could grow even in the most unpromising soil, and that intelligence and determination could overcome seemingly insurmountable obstacles. As they traveled home to Meriden Hall in the early hours of the morning, Penelope rested her head on Sebastian's shoulder and reflected on the strange journey that had brought them to this moment. 4 months ago, she had been a desperate girl being sold to a dying man. Now she was a countess, a partner to a brilliant legal mind, and most impossibly of all, a woman deeply in love with a husband who loved her in return. "What are you thinking?" Sebastian asked, pressing a kiss to her temple. "That life is stranger than any novel I have ever read. That scientific observation can change destinies. That the best partnerships are built on mutual respect and shared purpose." She tilted her head to look up at him. "And that I am profoundly grateful for every moment of our impossible journey together." "Then you will not be disappointed to learn that our journey is far from over." Sebastian's eyes gleamed with familiar intellectual excitement. "Dr. Wycliffe has written to me about establishing a research foundation to study unusual medical conditions that conventional physicians dismiss. He believes there may be dozens or even hundreds of cases similar to mine, people suffering from treatable conditions that are misdiagnosed because the medical establishment refuses to look beyond orthodox explanations." "A research foundation?" Penelope sat up straighter, her own mind already racing with possibilities. "Documenting cases, establishing registers for observation, challenging medical dogma with evidence?" "Exactly. And he suggested that you should be involved in the leadership, given your demonstrated skill at scientific investigation. Lady Meriden, how would you feel about becoming a patron of medical research?" The idea was so unexpected, so perfectly suited to everything Penelope had discovered about herself during these past months, that she laughed aloud with delight. "I would be honored, though I suspect the medical establishment will be even less pleased with us than they already are. Let them grumble. We have evidence and documentation on our side, along with the legal standing to fund and conduct research as we see fit. Between my legal expertise, your investigative skills, and Dr. Wycliffe's medical knowledge, we can make a genuine difference for people who suffer as I did, dismissed and abandoned by physicians who think they already know everything." Meriden Hall appeared in the dawn light as they approached, its windows glowing warmly against the pink-streaked sky. Home, Penelope thought with wonder. Not a temporary refuge or a prison of convenience, but a true home shared with a partner who valued her mind as much as her presence. The months that followed brought changes that rippled far beyond the walls of Meriden Hall. The Meriden Research Foundation was established with substantial funding, dedicated to investigating unusual medical conditions through careful documentation and evidence-based approaches. Dr. Wycliffe was appointed chief physician, and Penelope took on the role of director of research, bringing the same meticulous attention to data that had saved Sebastian's life. Within the first year, they identified and helped treat 18 other cases of grain sensitivity, each person experiencing transformations similar to Sebastian's when grains were eliminated from their diets. The Foundation published detailed case studies that, while controversial, began slowly changing how some progressive physicians thought about diet and disease. Sebastian used his legal expertise to defend the Foundation against attempts by orthodox medical societies to shut it down, arguing eloquently for the principle that scientific investigation should follow evidence rather than tradition. 2 years after their wedding, Penelope gave birth to a healthy son, William Sebastian Carlyle, whose arrival was celebrated throughout Merredon Hall with genuine joy. The pregnancy had been carefully managed under Dr. Wycliffe's supervision, with Penelope maintaining a grain-free diet that resulted in none of the complications often associated with childbirth in the era. "He has your eyes," Sebastian told Penelope as he cradled their son with surprising tenderness for such a large man. "And I suspect he will have your mind as well. Heaven help me when he grows old enough to argue." "And heaven help him when you start teaching him legal reasoning," Penelope replied, watching her husband with their child and feeling her heart overflow with contentment she had never imagined possible. Sebastian had returned to practicing law, taking on cases that challenged conventional thinking or defended those dismissed by society. His reputation was greater than ever, enhanced by the story of his own recovery and his willingness to champion unpopular causes. He argued a landmark case before the House of Lords regarding patient rights and medical treatment, citing his own experience as evidence that patients should have legal standing to question and refuse treatment they believed harmful. Penelope, meanwhile, testified before a parliamentary committee investigating medical reform, presenting the Foundation's research with such clarity and conviction that even skeptical politicians had to admit the evidence was compelling. The testimony made headlines, and Penelope found herself celebrated not just as the Countess of Merredon, but as a voice for scientific inquiry and patient advocacy. As for Lady Constance, she lived out her remaining years in Bath, increasingly isolated and bitter, watching from a distance as the niece and nephew-in-law she had tried to destroy built a life of purpose and happiness. When she died 3 years after the court hearing, her estate consisted of debts and recriminations, a stark contrast to the fortune she had schemed so hard to control. On their 4th wedding anniversary, Sebastian and Penelope stood together in the garden at Merredon Hall, watching William toddle through the roses under Mary's watchful supervision. The early evening sun cast everything in golden light, and Penelope leaned against her husband's side with deep contentment. "Do you ever think about how different our lives might have been if you had not noticed the pattern in my journals?" Sebastian asked, his arm wrapped securely around her waist. "If you had simply accepted the physician's pronouncements and resigned yourself to widowhood?" "I think about it sometimes," Penelope admitted. "But I believe we would have found each other somehow, even if circumstances had been different. Some partnerships are simply meant to be, written in the stars or fated by forces we do not understand." "That is remarkably unscientific of you, Lady Merredon." Sebastian's voice held gentle teasing. "Where is your evidence for fate and destiny?" Penelope turned in his arms to face him directly, her eyes bright with affection and mischief. "My evidence is us, my lord. 2 desperate people thrown together by necessity who discovered that protection can become partnership and partnership can become love. What are the odds of that occurring if not for some guiding force beyond simple chance?" "Astronomically small," Sebastian conceded, pressing a kiss to her forehead. "Though I suppose we could calculate the precise probability if we set our minds to it. We could document all the particulars, establish a baseline for statistical analysis. Or we could simply accept the miracle and be grateful for it," Penelope suggested, rising on her toes to kiss him properly. Sometimes, my brilliant husband, the evidence of our own happiness is sufficient proof without further investigation required. Sebastian pulled her closer, and as the sun set over Meridon Hall, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose, two people who had begun as strangers, united by desperate necessity, stood together as partners, as lovers, as friends who had chosen each other over and over again every day since that first impossible wedding. Their story would be told and retold, inspiring others to question authority, to trust their own observations, to believe that love could grow in the most unlikely circumstances. But for Sebastian and Penelope, the story was not about miracles or medical mysteries or triumphant vindications in court. It was simpler and more profound than that. It was about two people who had saved each other by refusing to accept the limitations that society and circumstance tried to impose. About partnership built on mutual respect and shared purpose. About love that grew not from grand gestures, but from quiet moments of understanding and support. And it was about proving that sometimes the greatest discoveries come not from those with credentials and authority, but from those willing to look at evidence with fresh eyes and ask the simple question that no one else had thought to ask: why? In asking that question and pursuing the answer with courage and determination, Penelope and Sebastian had not only saved a life, but had begun to change how medicine itself understood the relationship between diet and disease, a legacy that would extend far beyond their own remarkable story. Thank you so much for staying with us until the end. If this story touched your heart, please like, subscribe, and share with someone who needs to hear it. Your support helps us continue creating stories of love, resilience, and hope.